Good morning and welcome to today's conference of the International Schiller Institute, How to Inspire Humanity to Survive the Greatest Crisis in World History. We begin this morning with a musical selection from Johann Sebastian Bach from his Magnificat, the first movement, Magnificat Anima Meum Dominum. We want to welcome you from all around the world to today's conference and tomorrow's conference of the International Schiller Institute, How to Inspire Humanity to Survive the Greatest Crisis in World History. And you've just heard the opening movement from Bach's Magnificat BWV 243, performed by the Schiller Institute Chorus. The conference is dedicated to the 100th birthday of the co-founder of the Schiller Institute, the economist and statesman Lyndon LaRouche. You will be hearing much about him in the course of the next 2 days, but he was always in the habit of speaking for himself about the great matters of his time. There was no greater passion that Lyndon LaRouche had than his commitment to the liberation of people all over the world and his use of physical economy as a weapon in the battle to inspire humanity to be better than its destiny. What we're going to do is play you a short excerpt from a 1997 June presentation by Lyndon LaRouche on the subject of Africa. At the time, there was a great war going on in the Congo and other conflict, and he was addressing the issue of the broader international significance to everyone of how they should act in the face of these kinds of crises.
People are clinging to the delusion of something they're going to lose. And they're unwilling to accept the reality that we, as a soldier in war, sometimes has to face, the reality that we must choose a new road. So what must we do? We must use the precious little time available to us to organize around alternatives which we may not yet have the political support to implement, but which will work. And when there's obviously no other alternative, masses of people will rally around these things. But if they don't know about these ideas, if we don't organize around these ideas, then when the time of crisis comes, they'll just go crazy because they don't have a clear conception of an alternative. That is the world situation today. An immoral civilization is going to its doom, a self-imposed doom. We're well rid of it because it would kill us sooner or later anyway. The question is, have we the courage to adopt an alternative, and do we know what the alternative is? We must establish the axiomatic rule, not a do's and don'ts list, but the axiomatic rule, that no policy must be made which is not consistent with the fact that every human being is made in the image of God, and that their life is sacred on that account. Not only their biological life, but their right to development and their right to participate in society on the basis of that principle. That relations among states, relations within states, laws passed by governments must submit themselves to those principles. The only hope we have is to look at this horror and turn this horror of Africa, horrors which are similarly represented in other places, and turn that into a lesson quickly and say, this is what we are seeing. We are seeing a great civilization which is destroying itself because it has denied the right of human beings in Africa and elsewhere, the right to be treated as persons created in the image of God, has denied them the right to participate in their society, the right to honor their ancestors for what the ancestors gave them, the right to give their posterity what their posterity has a right to expect of them. And we must restore law, that principle of law. We must use the crisis which discredits this enemy of ours within, this great financial crisis, this collapsing system. We must intervene in that, introduce a new dimension of passion into that, and say we need a new civilization. We need the right turn in the road as we go from the broken past to the hopeful future.
If you've just joined us, we welcome you to today's conference of the International Schiller Institute, How to Inspire Humanity to Survive the Greatest Crisis in World History. You've just heard the late Lyndon LaRouche, economist and statesman and co-founder of the Schiller Institute, who would have celebrated his 100th birthday this past Thursday, September 8th. Now it's my honor and pleasure to introduce to you the founder of the Schiller Institute and its leader, the convener of today's conference, Helga Zepp-LaRouche. Good morning, Helga.
Hello, good day, wherever you may be around the globe. I welcome you. I want to speak about the subject that universal history must not end in a tragedy. Who wants to deny the fact that we are faced with the most dangerous moment in history ever? And let me say this forcefully from the beginning. This multifaceted, unprecedented crisis is entirely the result of wrong policies, and therefore it can be corrected. That is, if the political will to do so exists. And to mobilize that political will is what this conference, which commemorates the 100th birthday of my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, is all about. We face the acute danger of the strategic situation spinning out of control, leading to thermonuclear World War III, a situation which is more dangerous than at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And if it comes to that, would lead to the annihilation of mankind, a nuclear winter, and there would be not even a historian left to study the reasons why it occurred. And despite the fact that there is no question that that danger is very real, there are still some politicians talking that no scenario can be excluded. The tabloid Bild-Zeitung today is bragging that the present Ukrainian offensive in Kharkiv is helped massively by NATO, armored vehicles from the US and Turkey, tanks from Poland, intelligence from NATO, the US altogether giving $10 billion in weapons to Ukraine. Well, are all these countries and NATO not already war party? So the question is, when is the red line crossed, and when will we have a full-fledged war between Russia and NATO? Then, in addition, the financial system of the transatlantic world is hopelessly bankrupt. It's about to go through either a hyperinflationary blowout like Weimar Germany in 1923, only this time it would be not one country, but the entire so-called West, or we could experience very shortly ahead a chain reaction crash triggered by the belated increase of the interest rates through the central banks. The European Central Bank just increased 0.75%, the highest in its history. Jerome Powell from the Fed evokes the, quote, pain of the Paul Volcker high interest rate policy, which at the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, was over 20%. If you impose that now in the completely already bankrupt situation of many firms, over-indebted firms, already capital flight out of the emerging markets, this could trigger a prolonged plunge into a dark age of every country dependent on the transatlantic financial system. And if we would have such a collapse, it would naturally increase the war danger instantly. We already have a world famine. Already now in danger are 1.7 billion people in danger of starvation. According to the United Nations, each day, 25,000 people die of hunger, completely unnecessarily. And obviously, if there would be a crash, it would lead to the death of hundreds of millions, if not billions of people. The pandemic is not defeated. New ones are looming for the same reason COVID-19 erupted, because you have in a completely underdeveloped world, large parts of entire continents, you have the suppression of the immune system of entire populations. In Europe and in Germany in particular, we are right now with the policies of the present government going to crash against the wall this winter. There will be mass bankruptcies, mass unemployment, emergencies, blackouts. Banks like JP Morgan Chase are already preparing to leave Germany to London in case of a blackout, which they expect, or other capitals. Now, officially, we have a strategic situation where the rules-based order of the democracies of the West are against the nefarious autocracies and dictatorships of Russia and China. In reality, the situation is mirror inverted. The countries of Asia, led by the rise of China, the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and much of the global South, because they are building a new economic system with the aim to overcome poverty and have real economic development. There is a revival, a renaissance of the Bandung spirit, the revival of the non-aligned movement. And what these countries are absolutely determined this time is to end colonialism for sure. The colonialism which officially does not exist, but which came along in new clothes. And they want to implement this time for sure the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. Now let's take a look. What is actually the state of affairs in the so-called West? There is no democracy anymore. The possibility that the West could move towards a system of fascism with a democratic face was already discussed in the mid-70s by the Trilateral Commission and think tanks, who openly discussed that in the case of an economic collapse, it could be necessary to impose such draconian austerity that one has to do away with the basic constitutional rights. Samuel Huntington, of fame of the Clash of Civilizations, which was a blueprint for the North-South conflict to replace the East-West conflict, and the author of the horrible book, The Soldier and the State, which is an entire argument for mercenary armies to defend the empire, he wrote for the Trilateral Commission in 1975, The Crisis of Democracy, which was the idea that zero growth would make it necessary to limit democracy, that if governments are too democratic, then only a cataclysmic crisis would be sufficient to impose on the people the sacrifices which may be necessary. Well, that is the policy of Carl Schmitt, that sovereign is he who decides about the state of emergency. First picture. This brings us back to the point when Abba Lerner was telling LaRouche in the famous debate in the Columbia University that if people had accepted Wehrmacht, Hitler would not have been necessary. Now, 47 years later, democracy, which, a while ago one would assume includes the right for free speech, the democratic multitude of viewpoints could be exchanged, that idea is completely gone. There is no more knowable truth, which one can find out, at least in approximation, for example, through Socratic dialogue. Instead, one can only accept the one narrative. And much of so-called politics going on these days is the absolute attempt to have a dictatorial control over that narrative. Now, part of that narrative is that the Ukraine war was the result of, quote, an unprovoked Russian aggression. Even the mentioning that history didn't start on February 23, even if you say that there was a history before that, makes you a Putin agent, a follower or proponent of Russian propaganda. And if you propose to try to end the war as soon as possible, which is what the opinion is also of leading military experts, such as, for example, the German former General Kuyat, former General Inspector of the Bundeswehr and head of the Military Commission of NATO, a very high position, says that in a recent article that the war cannot be won by either side, that the sanctions may cause irreversible damage to the German economy, that our freedom was neither defended at the Hindu Kush, nor is it defended in Ukraine right now, that this escalation risks the escalation to a nuclear war. All of these are obviously very good reasons to negotiate a peace settlement. And if you say all of that, you are being put on a death list on Ukrainian websites, which are financed by the US State Department. Now, obviously, that is real democracy. And European governments participate regularly in meetings of these Ukrainian institutions, which run these websites, such as the Ukrainian Center to Counter Disinformation. You have right now in most of the West European and American countries, Britain for sure, a Gleichhaltung, a lockstep in the mainstream media, which makes Goebbels turn pale because of envy. You have an atmosphere of McCarthyism. You have a digitalized Gestapo. And during the last months, dozens of people told me privately that they are afraid to speak their mind, even in private circles, because otherwise they fear to be ostracized. And I want to say this for the record. we don't need Russian analysis to come to our conclusions. We have an international private news service, Executive Intelligence Review, which was created by LaRouche in 1974. And the NSC Senior Director of International Economic Affairs, Norman Bailey, in 1984, in the position as a White House advisor of the Reagan administration, told us that he considered EIR the best private intelligence service of the world. And more importantly, we are not gathering intelligence by reading newspaper clips, but by advocating our own policies. And then we evaluate the reactions and come to the conclusions and analyze what that means. We know the prehistory of the 23rd of February because we are part of it. Even before the Berlin Wall came down, LaRouche had forecasted the collapse of the Soviet Union absolutely correctly in 1984, where he said that if the Soviet Union would continue their then existing policies of rejecting the cooperation with Reagan on the SDI, of sticking to the Kiracofe plan, then they would collapse in 5 years. And that is exactly what happened. So we basically put out the answer to that, the productive triangle, Paris, Berlin, Vienna. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, we proposed to connect Europe and Asia through economic development corridors, and we called that the Eurasian land bridge. And it was our idea of a peace order for the 21st century. Please show the picture of the Eurasian land bridge, which then became the world land bridge, which is still our present policies. Now, it would have been in the self-interest of all countries to realize that proposal. We know that it was rejected for geopolitical reasons by Thatcher, Bush Sr., and Mitterrand, because at that point it was the policy of these countries to have the former superpower Soviet Union turn into a Russia which would just be degraded to be a raw material exporting third world country. And this was the idea in 91 to eliminate a potential competitor on the world market, because it was considered that Russia would have more educated scientists and more raw materials. So if you would allow economic development, it would become stronger than the United States at that time. But despite the fact that this policy was rejected at that time, we kept organizing for the Eurasian land bridge on 5 continents. We made hundreds of conferences and seminars. And from that standpoint, experienced and observed firsthand how the historic chance of 1989, please show the picture, was lost. And we published a book about that. And how the promises not to expand NATO to the east were broken. We observed firsthand by organizing for the Productive Triangle and the Eurasian Land Bridge in the Yeltsin years how the shock therapy reduced the industrial potential from 91 to 94 to only 30%. And the intention to ruin Russia was already there. And Yeltsin was the willing instrument of such policies. Now, after Putin came to power, the policies of color revolutions were implemented. Orange Revolution in Ukraine, 2004, Rose Revolution in Georgia, White Revolution attempted in Russia, Yellow Revolution attempted in Hong Kong against China. In 1999, Blair instigated the policy of the right to protect, which was the idea to replace the Peace of Westphalia order and the UN Charter with the rules-based order to give the basis for interventionist wars in Southwest Asia and Libya. No, we are not repeating Russian propaganda. We are attempting to give history a better direction, and we saw who supported this proposal and who opposed it. And most importantly, we are not the flat earth people. We have a different method of thinking which relates to the real physical universe of ideas, not on opinions based on sense perception. And that's why we cannot be nudged, the term of Cass Sunstein, into believing what is the allowed narrative. I said in the beginning, we have the worst crisis in history as the result of wrong policies, and therefore they can be corrected. Now, LaRouche forecasted in 1971, and this is probably the most important forecast ever made in history, that when Nixon introduced the floating exchange rates and cut the dollar from the gold standard, if the countries would continue with these monetarist policies, it would lead to a new depression, fascism, and a new world war. Or we would have to have a completely new economic system. Now, this was 51 years ago, and LaRouche made, in the meantime, 9 major forecasts and many, many more at each branching point. When the Trilateral Commission introduced the controlled disintegration of the world economy, and the authors of that all became then members of the Carter administration, this was the evil idea to never allow the emergence of mercantilist economies in the developing sector, never allow, quote, another Japan in the southern hemisphere, meaning that Japan, after being undeveloped for many centuries, then in the Meiji administration, Meiji restoration, suddenly made an industrial revolution in a few years, which obviously could be replicated by every developing countries. That was supposed to be outlawed. That was followed by the Volcker high interest rate policy, brutal austerity policy, Reaganomics, Thatcherism, mergers and acquisitions, outsourcing to cheap labor markets, just-in-time production, shareholder value society, going public of middle-level industries, market deregulation, derivative speculation, quantitative easing, negative interest rate, etc., etc. At each step, LaRouche not only made a brilliant analysis, but presented policy initiatives. Please show a couple of pictures illustrating what I'm saying now. He proposed the IDB in 1975, which was the idea to replace the IMF with a development bank which would allow the massive development of the developing sector. He proposed together and for President López Portillo, Operation Juarez in 1992. He proposed the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was implemented by President Reagan on the 23rd of March in 1983. We developed in all of this time programs for Africa, Latin America, Eurasia, Middle East, US. And LaRouche always was working on the idea that to avoid to plunge into a prolonged dark age, one had to get the institutions to reject and overturn the wrong assumptions of monetarism. What is involved here is a fundamental difference in the methodology of thinking. If one looks at the long arc of universal history, mankind has made an enormous progress. From the hunter and gatherer society, where the population did not surpass 10 million people on the planet, alone during the last 10,000 years, there was an enormous population growth to about 8 billion people today. We see that in that history, a recurring phenomena. Actual leaps forward occurred through Renaissance periods. Exemplary, I can name the classical Greece, the Abbasid dynasty, the Song dynasty in China, the Italian Renaissance, the German classical period. All of these are high phases of history, and they were always catalyzed by a relatively small number of individuals who contributed original discoveries as the result of adequate hypotheses in science and art. leading to new levels of understanding concerning valid principles of the physical universe. So far, each time these upturns were subsequently interrupted by the enemies of progress, who were able to induce society from the leading layers down to the credulous majority of the population to adopt views which ignored the realm of ideas just discovered and replaced them with ideologies suiting the interest of those enemies, i.e. the ruling oligarchy. The secret why LaRouche has been the most successful forecaster of economic and social tendencies, and all his critics have been utter failures, lies in the fact that he acquired throughout his life an unparalleled knowledge of those ideas, which over the course of millennia led to the qualitative advancement of human history. And those ideas, who would fold the universe down to, from what Gauss would call later the complex domain, to a reductionist Euclidean conception of things and events. Plato describes that difference to the paradox of the cave, where the real world of ideas exists outside of the cave, while those people who rely on their biological sense perceptual apparatus only perceive reality as shadows, as if upon the walls of a dimly firelit cave. A crucial example of that difference is highlighted by the paradoxes in geometry that do not allow reductionist solutions, such as the construction of the 5 Platonic solids and the doubling of the line, the square, and the cube. It is these paradoxes which laid the foundation in thinking for a whole class of thinkers who were thinking and subsequently making discoveries in the realm of the complex domain and the Platonic tradition, such as Brunelleschi, Nicolaus of Cues, Pacioli, Leonardo da Vinci, Kepler, Gilbert, Fermat, Huygens, Leibniz, Bernoulli, Kästner, Gauss, Lazare-Carnot, Dirichlet, and Riemann, and naturally Einstein and Vernadsky. All progress in human history has come from that tradition. LaRouche has demonstrated in numerous treatises. On the contrary, the ideologues of the reductionist tradition have done absolutely nothing to contribute, but a lot to obscure the insight into real knowledge, such as the Aristotelian tradition of Descartes, Newton. Remember his famous hypothesis non fingo, you don't need hypothesis, or I don't assume a hypothesis, Boyle, Euler, Lagrange, Laplace, Cauchy, Clausius, Grassmann, Helmholtz, Maxwell, Lindemann, Felix Klein, Bertrand Russell, and the student of those. The same is essentially true for ideas in art, where you have the fundamental axiomatic difference in the classical art aimed at the elevation of the creative power of the audience, and those forms of art which dwell on the banalizing or even worse, brutalizing the senses, the preferred method of the oligarchy for the control of the population. In this respect, there is no difference between the Roman Empire making the audiences of the amphitheater complicit in the killing of the gladiator, where the audience have to put thumbs up or down to decide if the gladiator dies or lives, and the cult of violence portrayed in the entertainment industry of today. LaRouche had a profound knowledge about the different axiomatic outlook of these opposite traditions and provided ample proof that the physical universe does not follow the pathway of Euclidean geometry, such in, please show the graph, the difference between the shortest distance, but the actual principle of the Leibnizian least action. In the same way, the physical economy cannot be described adequately by mathematic and statistical methods developed, and LaRouche developed his whole economic scientific method explicitly with a polemic against information theory and the systems analysis of Norbert Wiener and John von Neumann, or algorithms don't fit the real economy neither. but only by the methods of a Riemannian space-time of general relativity. It is only that thinking in terms of the complex domain which can conceptualize the impact of a never-ending series of discoveries of qualitative new principles of the physical universe, which each defines an entirely new economic platform where the newly discovered principle redefines the relative productivity of each aspect of the entire economy. Out of that methodological approach, LaRouche arrived at the unique concept of relative potential population density and the related concept of energy flux density in the production process, both of which must continuously increase per square kilometer and per capita because of the relative finite character of resources at each level of development. At each level, the cost of development of the resources tends to increase and thus lower the productivity of labor. With a stagnation of the technological level, the effort and cost to maintain the same number of people increases and the relative potential population density decreases. But the conclusion of that fact, which, as LaRouche concludes, is exactly the opposite of what the Evil Club of Rome concluded in its oligarchical propaganda pamphlet, Limits to Growth. Namely, that from now on, one needs zero growth and even negative growth, and that there are, and LaRouche wrote against that. Please show the picture. No, there are no limits to growth. In which Lin wrote one of his most important books, and demonstrated that continuous scientific and technological progress are necessary, and that higher degrees of anti-entropy are arrived by the continuous application of human creativity, and this is corresponding to the laws of the real physical universe, and this is therefore the precondition for the durable survival of humanity. The relative population potential in primitive society was approximately 0.06 to 0.1 persons per square kilometer, and the total potential of the world did not exceed 10 million. Today, with 8 billion people, there are more than 2 orders of magnitude more, and with the commercial use of fusion technology within reach and the existing technologies to produce essentially limitless amounts of new, fresh, and clean water, the population potential can double and beyond in a very short period of time and create a living standard for each human being comparable to the average family living in Switzerland today. Show the slide on energy flux density. From solar and wind energy with a very low energy flux density to fossil fuels to nuclear energy, this measurement increased from 0.2 kilowatt per square mile to 70,000 kilowatt per square mile, and has the potential to increase to 10 to the power of 15 with the second generation of fusion power. In light of this reality, the exit from nuclear energy in Germany and the EU policies of the Green Deal not only means the end of Germany as an industrial state, and that is the intention of the Greens, it also means the reduction of the relative potential population density of the world, because the productive capacity of the fourth largest economy of the world, Germany, will be subtracted, and this will lead absolutely to an increase of famine, epidemic, and social unrest. And that is the intention of the Malthusian oligarchy as well. LaRouche knew all the essential representatives of the two opposing outlooks, and he made it absolutely transparent for anybody who wanted to know why the elimination of creativity and the potential for genius was so absolutely essential for the oligarchical class, for whom the evil Malthus was only a paid scribbler. So it was clear that the common denominator between the outlook of the British East India Company, the controlled disintegration of the world economy of the Trilateral Commission, the great transformation of Hans-Joachim Schellenhuber and the great reset of the World Economic Forum is the same reductionist, empiricist, Malthusian ideology. When China recognized its error that the assumption of limited resources of the planet was wrong, they changed the one-child policy because they recognized that each additional child would contribute the potential of new creative discoveries, and they emphasized from there on the continuous need for innovation in the economy. Thus, the Chinese economy made a miracle which did not suffer economic cycles because the continued increase in productivity did eliminate the reasons for that. So the rise of China is the result of a correct economic policy which echoes the theory of LaRouche, and the United States and Europe are collapsing because they prefer Malthus over LaRouche. So the crisis in the West is entirely self-inflicted and not the result of evil policies of Russia or China. The BRICS countries, the SCO, which have their big summit on the 15th and 16th of September, so just in a few days from now, in the ancient Silk Road city of Samarkand in Uzbekistan, many organizations of the Global South working on a new world economic order, reviving the tradition of the non-aligned movement, all of these are aiming to end colonialism, overcome poverty and underdevelopment. And the Belt and Road Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, and the Global Security Initiative, which are proposed by China, these are all concepts to overcome the geopolitical confrontation and create a platform for a shared future of mankind. The United States and Europe, rather than trying to contain these developments, should rethink the reasons why we are in the mess we are. And we should join with these countries in a new paradigm of international relations based on the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence and the UN Charter. We are not only going into a hot autumn and winter, but what in all likelihood will be the collapse of the entire system. This is why the Schiller Institute has put the need for a new paradigm, a new security and development architecture on the table. So with Friedrich Schiller, we can say man is greater than his destiny, provided, however, if we follow the advice of Lopez Portillo and listen to the wise words of Lyndon LaRouche. Thank you.
Thank you, Helga. And if you've just joined us, we want to welcome you from all over the world to our 2-day International Schiller Institute conference, How to Inspire Humanity to Survive the Greatest Crisis in World History. We hope you will be with us throughout the next 2 days. This conference is also recognizing and celebrating the 100th birthday of Schiller Institute co-founder Lyndon LaRouche, economist and statesman who passed away February 12th of 2019, but September 8th would have been his 100th birthday. Our next speaker from the Slovak Republic is Jozef Mikloško, the former vice premier of Czechoslovakia and a longtime friend of the Schiller Institute.
Dear Helga and friends, thank you for the kind invitation to this conference. I am from Slovakia. 27 years I worked in research of mathematics and informatics on the Institute of Technical Cybernetics of Slovak Academy of Science. Then, after the Velvet Revolution, I was in many various functions as a member of the Christian Democratic Party in the government and parliaments, and also in diplomatic works in Rome. Allow me to proceed with my remarks concerning today's great situation in the Europe and also in the Slovakia. In 1989, communists closely collapsed. We had a chance to start living in truth. But nationalism, egoism, and Western shock therapy appeared, which was no therapy but shock for us. Many asked, why did you bring us out of Egypt? But turned 80 degrees back in the direction of freedom and democracy. Now, for 33 years, we are free. You can write and read what you want. We can travel, do business, and live we wish. We are limited by the crazy war, advertising, consumerism, fashion, and celebrities. However, people thinking has changed very little. Old habits remain: irresponsibility, laziness, and passivity. People's ability to distinguish between good and bad, important and unimportant, essential and non-essential, has weakened. The revolution freed us from the communists, but it also contributed to the great social differences, to the growth of unemployment, to the return of old structures, and the exclusion of former dissidents from politics. Consequences of the global financial, demographic, and moral crisis is also the breakdown of families, abandoned children, the pressure of advertising, anti-consumer culture, and now rising prices of energy, speculation, and growing bitcoins and stock market operations, and striving for greater polarization. The problem of capitalism, globalization, unemployment, dictatorship of financial markets, social issues, and resolved in the margin of the value of Western civilization, because these values are the cause of this problem. The only solution is a new lifestyle, solidarity, subsidiarity, and the recognition of the dignity of every human being. Today, moral disappears from the family, politics, economics, and culture. The demographic crisis, migration and emigration, flooding of people from other culture and changes, value, orientation, push us down. Europe is dying under the motto, united in diversity. Yes, it is diverse, but not united. Her social system produced too many unemployed. The public is manipulated by the aggression of communications and information industry in the media. Now, I mention some personal memories about Lyndon LaRouche. I met and discussed with him 17 times. In my 700 pages book, Top Secret When We Were Free, which were published in 1999, is about 80 pages about him and the Schiller Institute. We met in Slovakia 2 times, many times in America, and also 2 times in Rome, where I was ambassador of Slovakia for Italy. I became familiar with his case in 1990 when I was after the Velvet Revolution, the vice premier of federal government in Czechoslovakia. It was a tragedy that at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall, Lin was put nothing in the jail. In my life, I had never met such an educated person, economist, mathematician, musician, and historian who knew the answer to every question. He introduced Christian moral principles to economic. I was always surprised about his knowledge about classical music, supercomputers, religion, and also politics. He was a hard fighter for also full of humor and tenderness when speaking, for example, about love and God. He was always a generator of new ideas. His program was the need to produce, not speculate, moral principles would be established in politics and the economy. He predicted many things which are happening just today. I visited the United States 6 times because of him. I lobbied in Congress, in the Senate, in universities and conferences. The sentence for 15 years, his sentence, had so many irregularities that the international community, including myself, protested many times against it. I was proud. I too contributed to his parole in 1994. We met for the first time in August in 1993. Our friendship began at the prison in Rochester, where I visited him. His sentence of 15 years was a death sentence. Lin met me with a smile and optimism. We spoke for 6 hours. In December 93, I was proud that I was probably the first person on the earth to know that Lin would be free. I was very glad that in August 1994, Slovakia was the second country that he visited following his release. He met with many people, 120 young people from 17 countries. We organized for the conference in Smolnice Castle, House of Slovak Scientists. His second visit of Slovakia was in 1996. Also was very successful and interesting. At a conference in the United States in 1996, I asked him a question about God. The answer publicly for all was beautiful. The new wine I bring clean cannot be in old skins. We will start a new revolution based on Christian love. To our neighbors like a Samaritan was his last words. When Lin was 75, a gala concert held in the United States with many personalities, musicians, politicians. I was the master of this ceremony. I publicly asked him in this evening this question: what is the impact of media manipulation on people and what should be done about it? Hard question. His answer is actual also today. The situation in the media is terrible. Today's anti-culture is killing the youth physically and mentally. Sex is a commodity like Coca-Cola. It is necessary to change the basic axioms that many believe because man is different from animals. The philosophy of hedonism of the baby boomer generation is misguided. The result is Generation X, victims of this ideology. It is rather a degeneration than a generation because it has given up all historical experience. It has no opinion of its own. Jesus Christ showed us what it is to fight for truth and justice, that success does not depend on our abilities, that even if we lose, we must not compromise with evil. This was the answer on LaRouche for my really hard question. Dear friends, thank you very much for your attention, and I must tell them that I never can forget LaRouche, our contact with him, and I'm very glad to participate on this 100-year occasion of this big statesman and man. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I just finished my speech to the conference of Schiller Institute about 100 years of LaRouche, my friend from the past. Allow me to show you also some books with our contacts. The first 4 pictures are from my visit in Rochester, where Lynn was in jail for 15 years. This is there. Not very positive photos. Then next are when Lynn and Helga visited in 96 and 96 Slovakia. This is on the border between Austria and Slovakia. This is conference in Bratislava. Ladislav Mokry, very famous polyester of Slovakia, is on the right side of him. This is clear. This is conference on Christ Democratic Movement building, the same. Then Lynn is speaking. This is from Dolná Krupa, where we had the concert with Norbert Brainy, famous leader of Amadeus Quartet. Dolná Krupa is a place in Slovakia where Beethoven wrote his Moonshine Sonate, very famous. Now, this is also in our newspaper when Lyndon visits Slovakia. This is meeting with young people, especially abandoned children in institution Smile as a Gift, where my son Jozef is very active. Last photographs are from America. This is from some conference. This is also the same conference when Lynn was 75. This is interesting photos when Helga and Lynn are sitting on conference, and here is some control from federal government of the United States. I have still some books. I have spoken about this, my book, Strength When We Were Free, where about Lynn is 80 pages. Then this is my literary book, where there is also mentioned LaRouche and his life. This is a book from the last year, Silver Rose, where is Lynn mentioned many times. This book is absolutely new one, some weeks ago. 7 brave people on 7 hills of Rome. 183 picture, and where I was ambassador 5 years from this time, there are really some remarks about Rome, which is really beautiful, most beautiful town in the world. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Professor Mikloško. If you've just joined us, we want to welcome you to today's conference of the International Schiller Institute, How to Inspire Humanity to Survive the Greatest Crisis in World History. We're in panel 1, which has the same name, and you've just heard from Professor Jozef Mikloško of Slovak Republic, former Vice Premier of Czechoslovakia. We have a message from a prominent Russian economist who sent a personal birthday greeting on the occasion of Lyndon LaRouche's 100th birthday, and we are going to read a few short quotes here with the hope of making the entire message available in the near future. This year, progressive people around the world are observing the centenary of the birth of the brilliant thinker, and I wouldn't hesitate to say, prophet of our time, Lyndon LaRouche. If the leaders of the world's nations had listened to the voice of Lyndon LaRouche, then perhaps we might have managed to avoid the social upheavals we confront today as a result of the collapse of the world financial and economic system. If LaRouche had been elected president, the world today would be developing in a stable fashion. There would not be the growing chaos, there would not be the worldwide wars and provocations, and in practically all the major countries in the world that today are developing successfully, above all India and China, there are partisans of LaRouche. They have used his thoughts and ideas for creating their economic miracles. It is the principles of physical economy that he championed that today underlie the Chinese economic miracle and are there in the foundations of India's economic development policy. Lyndon LaRouche turned out to be right. Today, we rely on his work, his writings, in composing proposals for a very rapid transition to a new world economic paradigm. As we can see, countries that are taking this path are enjoying success. We have to muster all of our forces to fight that evil of war, and the creative legacy of Lyndon LaRouche helps us in this. May his memory live forever. Our next speaker is from China, Ding Yifan, Deputy Director for the Research Institute of World Development of the China Development Research Center.
I'm very pleased to be invited to say a few words about Lyndon LaRouche's contribution to understanding today's world. I first get introduced to Lynn's work when I met with Jacques Cheminade in France. He presented me Lynn's book, So you want to know all about economics. That's the first time I heard about physics economics. By reading his work, some new concept just struck me, such as entropy in an economy. If an economy is entropic, he will run out of development energy ultimately. Technological and technical innovation is key to maintaining development momentum and is an important anti-entropic factor. What Lynn had taught us about entropic factor in an economy could also apply to today's financial sector. Because instead of providing needed funding to real economy, as it should do, today's financial sector have invented a lot of products that will spin on themselves. So that becomes entropic and depleting a lot of resources. Lin had predicted rightly many financial crises because when he discovered a deviation of financial investment from real economy, he might see a danger arriving. Lin had forecasted rightly many financial crises in Latin America and in Asia. That's why he had a broad influence in those regions. In Washington, D.C., I had been introduced to Lyndon LaRouche by Mike Billington. And Lin taught me a lot about the evolution of synarchism in Europe and also in the world. Lin taught me that those people who seek to have the control over every country by meddling with financial crises may overlook the danger of financial gain. By inducing other countries into financial crises, those synarchists may succeed at the beginning. They may succeed in ship sharing, but ultimately they will kill all ship. So they will also lose the opportunity of further ship sharing in the end. That's why, after several rounds of financial crises in Latin America, in Asia, in Europe, the financial crisis came home to roost in the United States. Lin believed firmly in investing in infrastructures. He said that infrastructure investment could help the economy development in the long run, and infrastructure investment may lay the foundation for a healthy development. Lin always preached for strengthening cooperation among China, United States, and Russia, especially in the field of infrastructure construction. In this sense, Lin could be also considered as a precursor of China's Belt and Road Initiative. Today, as we are commemorating Lin's centenary, we should consider Lin's political legacy seriously, for it has told us that we can only make progress than mankind by promoting technology innovation, by promoting international cooperation, but not by confrontation. If we let today's world controlled by those who can find their interests behind the wars and escalation of geopolitical tensions, we will be dropped into a vicious spiral and end up by our planet destruction. So we should stand up and say no to those warmongers. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much also, Professor Yifan. And if you just joined us, welcome to today's International Schiller Institute Conference, Inspiring Humanity to Survive the World's Greatest Crisis. And that was just Professor Ding Yifan from China, the Deputy Director for the Research Institute of World Development, the China Development Research Center. We're now going to hear from Professor Georgy Toloraya. Professor Toloraya is one of Russia's foremost senior experts on East Asian and global affairs. He's represented Russia by holding senior diplomatic posts in North Korea, South Korea, Australia, and the Russian Foreign Ministry. A scholar and a prolific writer, he is currently the deputy chairman of the board of the Russian National Committee on BRICS Research. BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. His topic today is how we managed to bring the world to the edge.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure for me and an honor for me to address the conference, Inspiring Humanity to Survive the Greatest Crisis in Human History, which is very topical, unfortunately, because suddenly this year we encountered a political, economic, and existential crisis, which is truly can be compared only to the most serious milestones in human history. Of course, it's not sudden, it's not just a black swan, because this crisis has been in preparation for years, more than 3 decades, because when the Soviet Union collapsed, thanks to Mikhail Gorbachev, of whose demise I just learned. At this time, many people said about the end of history, meaning that now that West have finally won over communism and over any alternatives, there will be no more conflicts. However, that was not the case. Russia itself was very eager to join this new world order, this new West-led order as an equal partner, but Russia was denied this opportunity. Moreover, Russia's vital interests were not taken into account, and I'm not sure what plans are there in the West in relation to Russia, but judging by the attitude by the leaders of Russia, there could be quite a serious danger of trying to undermine the whole civilization. So for Russia, the war in Ukraine is not just Ukrainian war, it's the existential war. Russia is fighting not to gain territories or population or some resources. It has enough territories and resources in its vast territory. But in order to fight the imminent danger of disintegration of the country and the destroyal of the whole of Russian civilization. So this is the continuation of a century-old struggle with the West, and of course these days it is also a part of the global struggle for a new, more just international order, because the order and the system of global governance has been with us for the last 3 decades is West dominated. It's a unipolar world that they try to construct. And what the West is fighting for is not for democracy, but its dominance. Democracy is, of course, a good thing, but after all, it's just a system of governance. It's good when your neighbors having this system of governance, but why should you waste your resources and even lives of your soldiers in order to install this system into a foreign country? That's just a pretext. The real reason is dominance. Dominance, which translates into the economic dominance and, in fact, robbing other nations and the whole world to its own benefit. The new international situation when the rising powers want their share both in their striving for a better life and in governing their own destiny, of course, sooner or later should have come into contradiction with this reality. So hence the war that has just started as a part of a broader struggle, which unfortunately brings together vast parts of the world at a global confrontation, which we might just see just the beginning. and it unfortunately may continue for decades to come. But this is better that it would continue to decades as a slower burning conflict rather than an all-out war, which is not impossible, unfortunately. Sometimes the wars start accidentally and they escalate accidentally. So unfortunately, no one these days can exclude some accidental escalation of the war, which will bring about the thermonuclear apocalypses. God forbid that it would happen, but in the meantime, it is also important to have a positive agenda. Positive agenda meaning that, as I've said, the countries of the South and the countries of the non-Western part of the globe should struggle not for dominance, but for just order, which would enable them to take part in the decision making and implementing it and getting the fruits of their efforts. One of the reasons it doesn't happen is the unjust financial system, which is centered around dollar, which and this lets the emission center of it just reap the unearned benefits by being able just to print empty banknotes. This is why the call, which is promoted by LaRouche organization for a new Bretton Woods system, is, I think, very important and very relevant. Another factor is the joining of forces by biggest civilizational platforms in the BRICS format. It is now includes Brazil, Russia, China, India, and South Africa, and soon some other big countries like Argentina and others, Indonesia, and maybe Iran may join us. This is a real big force which can shape the global economic order and financial flows in a way which is more just and more satisfying to the whole world, not just for a small number of rentiers in the so-called gold billion countries. I think this is exactly what Nina LaRouche, whose 100th anniversary we will celebrate soon, was striving for. And I believe that this current conference is very topical for discussing all this issue and coming up with recommendations and ideas which can be supported all over the world. So I wish you all success. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Toloraya. We want to welcome everybody from around the world to today's conference, How to Inspire Humanity to Survive the Greatest Crisis in World History. You've just heard Professor Georgy Toloraya, and he is the Deputy Chairman of the Board of the Russian National Committee on BRICS Research, BRICS standing for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. His topic was how we managed to bring the world to the edge. Our next speaker is someone that people from the Schiller Institute know well, and hopefully all of the rest of you will know and appreciate him. His name is Ray McGovern, former senior analyst for the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, a founding member of Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, and a proud member of the Ukrainian Black List as well. So, Ray, good to see you today.
Can you hear me?
Ahead. Yes, you can be heard.
You can. Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a profound crisis indeed. It is unique. But there was something similar back in the days that I was born in the 1930s in Germany. We survived that. And we could survive this one too. Thinking back, I remember that a young lawyer in Berlin named Raimund Pretzel, who went by the pen name of Sebastian Haffner later when his diary was discovered. He was in Berlin during the worst of it, okay? And he was trying to make his peace with what was going on. And I want to quote a few sentences in English from the English version, which is called Defying Hitler. The German version is called Die Geschichte eines Deutschen. Here's Haffner. The individual who is opposed to fascism is just an ordinary man with many weaknesses, but he enters the duel with a quiet determination not to yield. You will have to admit that for someone who is neither a hero nor a martyr, he manages to put up a very good fight. Will you see him compelled to abandon the struggle? Well, Haffner had to say the following about that. No, the Germans lost. And why? I do not see that one can blame the majority of Germans who in 1933 believed that the Reichstag's fire was the work of the communists. Or for that matter, parenthetically, can you blame the most of the Western people who are subjected to propaganda that the invasion of Ukraine was unprovoked? What one can blame them for, says Haffner, is that with sheepish submissiveness, the German people accepted that as a fact. The fire was a fact, and they lost their little personal freedom as though it was necessary, their freedom. If the communists burned down the Reichstag, it was perfectly normal that the government would take, quote, decisive measures, end quote, reversing all their personal freedoms. What was missing was an iron resolve. What was missing is the kernel of integrity that in animals is called breeding. There were enough people in Germany and elsewhere to have faced up to things, but that didn't happen. This time, there are enough people in the world to face up to the situation that exists, and it's going to happen. Now, how can I be so confident about that? Because I think that sheepish submissiveness is not going to be possible when people have to put on 10 blankets this winter and still cannot get warm. I think even the people, the sheepish people in Western Europe and Eastern Europe and will have to be able to contend with what goes on here, even though they are clearly outmatched by the forces that rule them. And I say that with some confidence. Some of you will know that a Hungarian Jewish lawyer named Ferenc was the last one to die among the Nuremberg prosecutors, okay? He was a remarkable man. If you don't know about him, look it up, okay? But he had this advice to us. He said, look, if you want to pursue justice, go into it thinking that you're going to succeed, because you know what? You will succeed if you fulfill 3 conditions. 3, just 3. Never give up, and never give up. Okay? So let's look at life. Let's look at promise. Let's look at all the people who are tuned in today and who are willing and able to make the sacrifices necessary to make it better for the people of the world. And I'd close with a metaphor that was used a little earlier, and that is the metaphor of the gladiator. And what are we going to give the gladiator? We're going to give him a thumbs up. The world is going to make it through this one, but only if we never give up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ray. That is exactly what I thought you might do, even though I didn't know exactly what you would do. And we'll be hearing from Ray McGovern and from others, and we get to questions and answers. We have a final presentation for today by Dr. Clifford Kiracofe, United States, former senior staff member of the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations and president of the Washington Institute for Peace and Development.
I would like to thank the Schiller Institute for inviting me to speak at this important conference. Over the years, from memorable lunches with Lynn at his home in Virginia to conferences in Berlin with Helga, the intellectual atmosphere has been stimulating amidst kind and thoughtful hospitality. Today, my topic is America Alone in a Changing World? There's a question mark in this title because it remains to be seen whether Washington will change its policies from confrontation to constructive engagement with the international community. By international community, I mean the sovereign states represented in the United Nations General Assembly. The United Nations must be strengthened and put at the core of the international system. The international system today is rapidly changing from a US-dominated unipolar system to a pluralist multipolar system. We see the rise of China, the return of Russia, the emergence of countries such as Iran, Indonesia, Mexico, Egypt, Brazil, and increasing influence of various formats and organizations such as the BRICS, ASEAN, SCO, and the Eurasian Economic Union. Then we have a new situation in Europe with the Ukraine war and its economic and diplomatic impact, not only on Europe, but on the world as a whole. I would like to add that the China-Russia relationship is a key factor, and the February 4th joint statement this year by Presidents Xi and Putin marked a new stage in the development of international relations. An increasingly belligerent and irrational United States may well find itself isolated and alone as never before in a changing world that seeks peace and development. Taiwan and Ukraine are salient issues at this time. The Pelosi visit to China, to China's island of Taiwan, increased tensions. Pelosi's escapade occurred in the context of Washington's proxy war against Russia in Ukraine and its empty-handed diplomacy in the Pacific, Asia, and Africa. Pacific Island states, ASEAN, and African states politely have rebuffed U.S. efforts to enroll them in a crusade against China and Russia. European leaders entangled in the NATO alliance follow Washington's diktats. The economic and social fallout of Washington's Ukraine war takes its toll on Europe, as we see every day. No doubt, political instability will develop in Europe as publics experience the effects of their leaders committing economic suicide by supporting the American proxy war in Ukraine and by supporting US sanctions against Russia and China. The United States lost the Korean, Vietnam, Afghan, and Iraq wars. It now appears that it will lose its Ukraine proxy war. Did Washington become a rogue state since World War II over victory over German Nazism and Japanese militarism? Not a few scholars and observers would say so. Does the US promote world peace, cooperative diplomacy through the United Nations, and international law? It is hard to hide the fact that Washington does not, critics say. The Pelosi whirlwind tour through Asia was intended to reinforce Washington's anti-China policy, but no one was biting. Significantly, the South Korean leader chose to have dinner with friends rather than to see Pelosi. ASEAN members politely reminded Washington that they do not want to choose sides in an American zero-sum game in the Asia-Pacific. U.S. Secretary of State Tony Blinken was similarly rebuffed on his most recent Africa tour against Chinese presence in Africa. That's what he was aiming at. It is no surprise that the South Africa took a deep and a dim view of this effort. The country is a member of BRICS group, along with Brazil, Russia, India, and China. BRICS today is expanding its reach as a number of countries are knocking at its door, seeking admission. There are good practical reasons to become a member of this organization because it supports economic development and cooperation between members in various fields. The organization respects members' sovereign right to choose the development model most suitable to their culture. Washington's strategic mistakes, the U.S. national strategy and foreign policy made 3 grave and irreversible mistakes over the past 6 decades. The Vietnam War, the post-Cold War policy of hegemonism, and the Afghan-Iraq wars. U.S. leaders learn nothing from their mistakes and failures. The old Cold War terminated through diplomacy and an agreement between U.S. President Ronald Reagan and Soviet Union President, the late Mikhail Gorbachev. But U.S. ruling circles, during a multi-year bipartisan project, prepared the new Cold War during a series of high-level conferences in 2004-05, which is almost 20 years ago. The purpose of this project was to restart the old Cold War and to reestablish a bipolar bloc system, if not a unipolar system. The old 2-block Cold War system between the so-called free world and the so-called communist world was converted, and a new phrase was established, that is to say, the democratic world versus the authoritarian world. So again, a bipolar approach. It is noticeable that this project, called the Princeton Project, headed up by George Shultz for the Republicans and Tony Lake for the Democrats, included a number of high officials, think tank persons, academics, and so on. It issued a final report in 2005. The co-director of the project staff, Anne Marie Slaughter, went on to head the policy planning staff of the U.S. State Department under President Barack Obama and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. I just want to show this continuity between the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and the Biden administration in terms of this foreign policy of containment, we can say, of Russia and China. It's notable that this policy group included foreign participants such as the Japanese diplomats and scholars, as well as Australian intelligence officers. Thus, the US, Japan, India, Australia Quad anti-China alignment, and the more recent Australia, UK, US AUKUS alignment, anti-China alignment, should come as no surprise. The Quad concept was embodied in the late Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's Diamond strategy against China. Because this project was bipartisan, it was logical that it would carry forward through the next administrations. Biden continues this elite US foreign policy consensus. In fact, the Biden administration pushed for this consensus policy to a sharper and more intense level than under Trump or under Obama before him. US belligerence has become more pronounced and sharp. The explanation is simple. Throughout his career in politics, in the US Senate and as vice president under Obama, Biden followed the establishment's foreign policy consensus. So Biden's new Cold War policy should come as no surprise. Some foreign capitals, academics, and observers may be surprised that Biden's policy is not more moderate than Trump's. But after a year and a half of the Biden administration, foreign policy, perhaps they should reflect on any mistaken perceptions and analytical methods. So what's ahead for Washington? Evidently, it is not reasonable to expect a change of heart in the US establishment and its foreign policy anytime soon. Of course, the American people desire peace and development, but this is not the approach of the US establishment. So the new Cold War will go on, although it is a dead end for the United States and its European NATO allies. How long it takes to hit the dead end is an open question. It's reasonable to expect that because of the inexorable shift toward a multipolar world, the United States will become more isolated. If it does not drop its belligerent and bellicose policy of hegemony, US policy with its continuing features of neo-imperialism and neo-colonialism serves only to increase US isolation over time. The international community rejects that type of behavior increasingly. And a counterweight to that behavior is in the formation in this new multipolar international system. Washington's politicians must make an agonizing reappraisal of US foreign policy and drop hegemonism and Cold War thinking. Otherwise, the American people in the future may find their country alone in a changing world. In conclusion, only through a constructive engagement by Washington with the international community can a new paradigm emerge that promotes peace through development and a positive and optimistic vision of the international community with a shared future. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, and thank you, Dr. Kiracofe. You've just heard from Dr. Clifford Kiracofe, former senior staff member of the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, and president of the Washington Institute for Peace and Development. So we are now going to go into our question and answer period, and we have Helga and Ray with us. I believe also Cliff Kiracofe is with us as well. We'll bringing him up on the screen in just a minute. And I guess what I want to first do before we go to questions and discussion is just ask Helga if there's a particular response that you have to what you've heard so far.
Well, I think that the point which was made by Cliff just now, I can only confirm that the mood of the world has changed dramatically, and what was also coming through in some of the other messages read. I mean, the time where the United States and the British, based on the special relationship between the Anglo-Americans, can dictate the rest of the world and they all will follow. That has clearly ended. That may be the case of some people who have the identity of underlings, like the present German government, which is an unbelievable example of sheepish submissiveness, which Ray was addressing. It's almost that there are, there are photocopies of whatever Blinken says, Baerbock says. It's an amazing phenomena. But that, is not the case. Jozef was talking about that the European Union is not unified. That is absolutely the case. And I think come the big storm of the coming weeks, you will see that the EU will have enormous problems to stay together. And it's definitely not the case for the majority of the developing countries. Cliff was referring to it, first of all, the BRICS will have new members. Argentina has applied. Other countries like Indonesia, Egypt, Nigeria, there are many countries who are absolutely refusing to be drawn into the geopolitical confrontation and do not want to take sides and do not want to be part of this divide and conquer game. So, I do share the optimism of Ray, that I also deeply believe that we can come through this period if we mobilize. It's not going to be histomat, historical materialism, and it's not going to be diamat, dialectical materialism. With other words, it's not coming by itself, but it does require the active intervention of many people of goodwill to, listen to what Cliff was saying, that, we hope still that in the United States and in Europe, there are enough people who recognize that the age of confrontation should be over, because what Dr. Toloraya was saying, the danger of an accidental war is so big that, if people would be rational, they would have sleepless nights over just that possibility. And that in the last year, there were many incidents where it was only the ability of pilots to fly very well and escape risky situations why things did not go out of control. And I have said many times, if world peace depends on the ability of a pilot to fly his plane well, we are in tough shape. So it's not a self-evident outcome of this period. I think what everybody should really reflect upon is, on the one side, we are looking at the potential extinction of civilization. I mean, that is a thought which is really unbelievably real. On the other side, the majority of the world, and I really mean in terms of numbers, the majority of human beings living on the planet today want to end imperialism, colonialism, and they have a new self-confidence. I mean, many of the Asians are completely different in terms of their outlook than the so-called Westerners, because they think the Asia century is coming. It's already beginning. And they are very optimistic in terms of the potential of the future. And they are very proud in terms of having, revived their 5,000-year-old history. And they are very optimistic. But the thing which bothers me is that I would really regret to see that Europe becomes a sideline, fossil relic of a civilization which didn't make it. In the worst case, Asia will rise, and countries like Germany will be only visible in a museum in Mali or some other place as an example of a civilization which went under. I would hate that because I think Germany and Europe have produced so many great cultural goods, but right now we are on the wrong way. And I think, the memory of my late husband is exactly the way to shake up the world. And, it is really true that the countries who follow, and this was the message which we heard from this prominent Russian, the countries who are applying the economic principles of my late husband are doing well, and those who follow Malthus are in a complete collapse. So that is the issue, in my view, which we have to, get a solution to.
All right. Well, thank you. Let's go now. We have Cliff is with us and Ray. And let me first ask you, Cliff, if you have any response or any reflections on everything else that you heard today.
Well, it's been very stimulating, and I certainly concur with.
Hold on, I'm having a problem with this audio. No, it's a little, it's low.
It's too low?
It's Cliff, we're hearing you a bit, but it's a low volume.
I can turn it up. That's right. That's better?
Nah, we're still having a problem.
All right. It shouldn't be.
It's as though it's being filtered.
How's that? Is that better?
Not really. It's a little better.
Oh, is that better?
Well, we can make you out. I tell you what, go ahead and just try to speak loudly.
Well, all right.
Yeah, it's a little bit distorted.
Let's see here. Is that
That's
better?
Go ahead.
Okay, so let's go with his. I
Yeah.
apologize. So I agree with all the comments made by colleagues.
Hold on,
today,
we lost you again
and,
for some.
I like,
Hello, we lost you again. You were.
shouldn't- How's that?
That's
that?
fine if you.
Is that better?
Yes.
All right, we'll keep it that way. Then, again, I'm sorry, I apologize.
Go ahead.
I agree with my colleagues, and I like what Ray said about we're not going to give up. None of us should give up, and we should encourage others to press ahead. Don't forget, after the World War I, we had the League of Nations. After World War II, we had the United Nations. There was an international effort to make things better. I think we need to revitalize the United Nations. I think the new Bandung spirit that Helga mentioned, particularly in the global South, this new Bandung spirit is very important in a situation where Washington is continuing to push its unipolar policy and its belligerent and bellicose policies, as we've seen in its proxy war with Ukraine. So in the interest of world peace, we certainly can't give up. And in addition to that, we need cooperation, just as this conference is showing. Our Russian colleague, our Chinese colleague, colleagues from around the world, Europe, are concerned, have mutual concerns, and are working together to support what the Chinese have called the vision of a community with a shared future. So I think this is, for me, the main comment I would make is that we need to strive and not give up on promoting a vision of a shared future. And that would mean recognizing or helping to support and strengthen the United Nations at the center of the international system, and to strengthen international law so we can achieve justice and fairness in the international system. So that would be my first comment. And I apologize for the audio.
Yeah, well, that's fine. We've straightened it out. You're with us now. And well, now we can start to get the questions. Now, the first question is actually going to be given by the moderator in this case. Now, this is a particular thing that I'd like to have you discuss because it's rare that we have three people that can all discuss this sort of question, and it's the following. I posed in something I wrote in preparation for this conference that the Schiller Institute and its interlocutors must act as the nemesis of the presently prevailing civilizational direction of the transatlantic world. In other words, its dissolution. And that nemesis is a different thing. It's not street justice. It's not retribution merely. It's a higher idea. And it's this notion, in part, I was contending, of a higher law, which is outside of the so-called rule of law of tyrants. And they never really can quite see how that these forces of their nemesis are able to sort of forecast what they do, how they think, why what they are doing is destined to fail. And those forces characterized by the kind of folly and hubris that we're seeing in the transatlantic world are confronted by something that's greater. And it's not just, as I say, retribution. And I wanted to ask you to all discuss this idea, whether you agree or disagree with what I said. I want to start with you, Helga, and then go to Ray and Cliff, because I believe that if we can give people a discussion of some of these classical ideas, that's probably going to be a very useful way for them to think about how we're approaching this whole issue of foreign policy. So, Helga?
Well, I just remember when the Iraq War of 2003 started, we had a conference, a Schiller conference, and I started my speech by saying, do these fools not know that there is such a thing as nemesis, that you cannot start a war based on lies and think you get away with it? And some more things like that. And the reason was already clear that the war was based on complete lies, that Saddam Hussein had no weapons of mass destruction, that he had not backed up Al-Qaeda. As a matter of fact, Saddam Hussein was famous for having put in jail a lot of such people. In any case, so, what is this nemesis? It is a higher power. In the European philosophy, it was called natural law. In other cultures, it's called cosmic power, mandate of the heaven. I mean, there are many different ways, but in all cultures you have, or in many cultures, you have such an idea that there is a higher lawfulness, and that even if, not every little sin is being punished, but you cannot violate this higher order over a long time without that it comes back and hunts you with a vengeance. And one of the reasons why the Schiller Institute is called Schiller Institute is because of, naturally, Friedrich Schiller and his outlook. And our cultural magazine in Germany is called Ibicus. Now, those of you who are familiar with Schiller, even if you're not German, may know the Cranes of Ibicus, which is one of the most powerful poems I know of. It's about the story of a poet who gets killed. He's on his way to the poets competition, and since there's nobody to watch his to help him. He says, "You cranes who are flying over my being murdered, you should be my vengeance. You should help." So then, when all the poets are meeting and they are collecting themselves in a big theater, the Erinyes come. The Erinyes are the goddesses of revenge. And Schiller makes something poetically absolutely incredible, because he changes the rhythm and has the Erinyes walk in the center of the theater, and the language becomes so powerful, because the Erinyes evoke this higher power. And at one point, the poem goes, "Als ob die Gottheit nahe wär," as if the divine would be present. And then the cranes fly over the theater, and the two murderers, which are among the people sitting in the audience by now, they say, "Oh, sieh da, Timotheus, die Kraniche des Ibicus." And then the people who all are mourning about the murder of the poet Ibicus, they say, "What's with this name of the person who was just murdered? This must come from the murderers." And so, in any case, they put them in front of the tribunal. And Schiller basically, in the letters about the poem Ibicus, I think it's in exchange with Goethe, he says, "Why do the murderers reveal themselves? Surely not because they have a bad conscience, because murderers don't have a conscience. They're just low life and do what they do. But the presence of the divine, which was called forth by the Erinyes walking in the theater, established some higher power, and they could not control it." So I can only, this was not prepared, and very briefly, I'm not doing justice to this incredible poem. I can only ask people who want to know about the Nemesis, look at this poem and have it read loudly, and you will see. Maybe we should put a version of it on the webpage so that people can actually see. This is how Nemesis works. There is this higher power which intervenes, and criminal behavior of human being has no power to avoid it. This has been a big subject in Greek tragedy, where it has played a role all the time. But I think the concept of nemesis, it doesn't matter how you call it, if you call it, higher power, divine power, natural law, it does exist, and it is part of the built-in features of our universe, for the same reasons why Leibniz's conception about the best of all possible worlds is also an innate feature of our universe, that a great evil always tends to bring forth a bigger, very higher power of goodness. So there are many secrets about these matters which I think are very relevant to the outcome of the present history.
Okay, Ray? You seem to be muted. Well, no, we're not hearing you. Hold on. Try again. Hold, we're trying to figure this out. It's not. We're having some problem. Do you think you should reconnect? It's being suggested by our tech people that you might have to reconnect if you can't solve it. Sorry about this. I don't know why these things are happening. Okay. No. So, Cliff, let's go to you while we try to get Ray straight.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, but if just speak up a little bit. We can hear you, though.
Yes. Okay, fine. I'll pick up on from what Helga was saying, and of course, the memory of Schiller and that particular poem. I still actually at the house here have my grandmother's copy of Schiller in 4 volumes in the old-fashioned German script. The concept of nemesis, of course, comes to us paired with the concept, ancient Greek concept of hubris or arrogance, overbearingness. And nemesis occurs as the antidote or the result of this overreaching hubris. I would just make a short comment that in ancient Greek classical thought, we have the concept of Dike, D-I-K-E in Greek. Dike represents the general concept of justice and fairness. Basically, Dike is justice and fairness. So it's a bit of a higher principle, say, than nemesis that Helga was alluding to. What nemesis wants to remind us of is we don't want to overreach in hubris because that's undermining the general moral value, ethical values of justice and fairness. And I would just say that if we take a look at the February 4th joint statement between President Xi and President Putin, we see there, as well as in various BRICS communiques and documents and other documents of various platforms, the very ideal of pushing toward a world with justice and fairness among nations. And so, in brief, I just would like us to think about continuing what Helga was saying, this concept of nemesis, and then that higher level of Dike, or justice and fairness between nations. That's
okay.
it.
Okay, thanks. So we have Ray back. We're going to try this again.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're back. Okay, great. Sure.
All right. Well, I am refreshed to be reminded of my 6 years of classical education. It's nice to have nemesis on our side. You don't have to have read all of Euripides or Sophocles or Aeschylus to realize that this was the downfall of all those tragic heroes. Hubris brought nemesis. Now, what's nemesis? Well, what's hubris? Hubris is encapsulated by the notion that the United States, and by extension, the United States' territories like Great Britain and other places, are exceptional. This is what Tony Blinken and what's his name, Jake Sullivan, learned in their Ivy League schools. We are exceptional, okay? Now that cuts right across the grain of what that clip from Lyndon LaRouche said in the beginning. If all men and all nations are created equal, how can it be that a nation can consider itself and want others to consider it exceptional? Well, that's the reality here. And that, my friends, is the hubris. Now, I have so much enjoyed this conversation and many others that we have been having under this banner of Friedrich Schiller. And, I'm reminded in passing that Beethoven stole from Friedrich Schiller, alle Menschen werden Brüder, okay? All men are becoming brothers and sisters. It's important. That's what we have to head to. Now, underneath this discussion, I'm reminded of Well, a fellow that I read a lot about, his name was Lenin, okay? Lenin wrote one book saying, "Что делать?" What is to be done? That's where I am. What is to be done? Well, the first thing to be done is what we're doing right now. Next thing is to spread that around to all the people we know in whatever way we can. But then we have to act. Now, what are we going to do? Well, there's no great need for a grandiose plan right now. We can all act in our own peculiar circumstances. Back in the 1930s, that was possible early on for the Germans to do. What happened to the Social Democrats? Well, they caved in to Hitler. So we don't want people to cave in. Now, I'm just going to give you one example of what we're trying to do here in Raleigh, North Carolina. The Boy Scouts of America have invited George W. Bush to give an address to the Boy Scouts here in Raleigh, actually a wider gathering, next Wednesday, the 14th of September. Now, George W. Bush cannot travel abroad for fear of being arrested under the principle of universal jurisdiction. He had to cancel a trip to Geneva in 2011 for precisely that reason. He was to be arrested on the tarmac. So why should he be able to come to Raleigh, North Carolina to inspire our Boy Scouts? Well, you know what? He may not come when the Secret Service learns about, well, how shall I say it, about our welcoming committee, all right? This man self-confessed. Some of you probably know that just 4 weeks ago, in a major speech in, I think it was Dallas, it was Texas anyway, he said he was decrying, I decry the fact that one man can decide on a unprovoked, brutal invasion of Iraq. I mean Ukraine. Iraq too. That's a quote, folks. What did the people do? They laughed. Those Texan people laughed. Now, this man is a war criminal by international standards. He should be held to account. All I'll say, and without divulging too much, is that we are going to remind people about that. Maybe he'll cancel out. That will be all for the better. That way, we'll protect our Boy Scouts here in this area from being subjected to the charges that, well, that one prominent Greek, was accused of, and that was 2 charges. Making, Socrates was his name, of course, making the worst cause appear the better, and corrupting the youth. We don't want that to happen here in Raleigh. And so why do I cite that? I cite that because it's going to happen in about 3 or 4 days. We're going to make sure that we do our part to educate the people here in North Carolina as to what kind of unabashed evil deeds this person is responsible for, torture being among them. And there have to be many opportunities to point out not only the idiocy of people like Behrenbach in Germany, but the proven cooperation in many of these crimes on the part of many of the leaders in Europe. I'll just close with one little example. There's a fellow named Anders Fogh Rasmussen. Now, he was a big Danish personage, and he was made head of NATO, Secretary General of NATO. He's on a committee to vet misinformation in the United States now. What did he say 3 days before the war on Iraq. He said, we know there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. It's not that we think they're in Iraq. We know they're in Iraq. Now, why did he say that? Because the U.S. told him to say that. And we have a lot of puppets in Europe right now who say things because the U.S. told them to say it. So there's a little example. There have to be lots of Anders Fogh Rasmussens roaming around Europe and elsewhere where you can pin them down and say, why did you say, we know there are WMD, weapons of mass destruction, in Iraq? There weren't any, of course, and we knew that full well. So this just by way of saying that this action, it seems to me, needs to be local, at least at first. Each of us has their own little specific circumstances in which to operate. We here in Raleigh will not be missing when it turns out that action is needed. Что делать? Well, what's to be done? We know what's to be done on Wednesday. Thank you very much.
Okay, so whether you prefer Chernyshevsky or Lenin, what's to be done is certainly the question. Now, we have a question for the whole panel, which is this. This comes from New York. How realistic is it to switch course now to a new paradigm where countries can dialogue and start on an equal footing? Every day, it seems that there's only a development that makes things worse. Take Liz Truss, for example, coming in and saying that Britain should be ready to use first strike nuclear attacks. People are going to freeze to death and go into bankruptcy from paying energy bills. How can we ensure we're in the right place when the inevitable revolt against these murderous policies happens to best direct the direction of where things should go? So who would like to take that? It's for the whole panel. Okay, I'm going to send that to Helga then, and we'll see what the other two of you have to say.
Well, I think that the next several weeks and months will be the most tumultuous of our lifetime. There are many people too late and too little, but nevertheless, many people in Germany who predict that the policies of this so-called economic minister, he has no inkling. Can you imagine he was at a talk show with a woman called Maischberger, and she said, are you not aware that there will be a wave of insolvencies following the increased gas prices and energy prices? And then he started to, stutter, and he said, well, yeah, maybe some of these bakeries and some of these flower stores, they may close for a while, and then they can open up later on. And he was talking like that. So this has caused a storm. The Baker Association, they said, what are you talking about? When we have to close down, we still have to pay rent, we have to pay wages, and we go bankrupt, we will go insolvent. What are you talking about? So what you see right now is such a degree of incompetence of the policies of people in the leadership of the European Union bureaucracy, or this so-called streetlight coalition in Germany. So this will create a situation. They are now trying, they know this will be a hot autumn. They're trying to preemptively criminalize the protests by saying they will be taken over naturally by Putin and by extremists and so forth. But, I just remember how it went with the GDR when the GDR went bankrupt or the economic policy was coming to an end. When you have, 10 people in the street, you can arrest them. But when you have millions of people in the street, there's nothing you can do, because then there are so many people in the streets who have brothers and sisters who are in the army, who are in the police. So I hope that it doesn't come to that, because, that has a lot of risks, and, would go with a lot of insolvencies, unemployment, and so forth. So, but I think the spectrum that it will come to that people will not accept to only take a wash clothes to clean themselves and not take showers anymore, to freeze, to only heat one room in the apartment, to have blankets and pullovers instead of heating. I mean, these people are absolutely insane, in what they propose. There would be a very easy way to avoid all of that. Stop the confrontation, get into a negotiation with Russia about Ukraine, get to a peace settlement, and then the gas can flow again. You can open up the Nord Stream 1 and 2. Then, even more important, we will have the G20. Indonesia was pressured a lot not to invite Putin to come. Indonesia says we are not going to not invite Putin because the whole G20 would lose its meaning, because it's supposed to bring together the 20 most powerful nations of the world. So they are inviting Putin. Putin is probably going, probably also Xi Jinping. They're meeting in any case now at the SCO meeting. And then you will have a situation where you will have the Western countries and the representatives of the BRICS, the SCO, all in one conference, the G20. And if there is any reason among the people in the United States in high positions and in Europe, there is still time to use that G20 meeting to put a real new policy on the table. There is a collapse of the financial system. We have started to organize signatures for a new Bretton Woods ad hoc committee of people who support the idea that it was a mistake what Nixon did to abandon the old Bretton Woods system. We need to have a new Bretton Woods system now, which obviously must not have the injustices of the old one, because Bretton Woods was never realized in the way Franklin D. Roosevelt had intended it, because he died, and then Truman and Churchill never fulfilled his promise to overcome the underdevelopment of the developing countries, which was the most important feature what Roosevelt had intended. So this time we have to have a new credit system. We have to reorganize the old bankrupt one. It's hopelessly over inflated. It will go into a hyperinflationary collapse or a sudden collapse. And a new system has to be agreed upon. And the new name for peace has to be development, which is why we have demanded a new security and development architecture, which must put all of these things in one package and put it on the agenda. And the G20 meeting, which takes place in November, would be the ideal place, to have such a policy reform. And if that would occur, I said it many times, nobody hates the Americans, but they hate the imperial policy, which is really the copy of the British Empire, and the fact that we have now King Charles, can you imagine that? And Liz Truss, and then possibly next NATO secretary, this lady from Canada. I mean, that would be quite a trio. Let's hope that that policy is somehow not going to be the dominant one. But I can only say we could escalate our efforts for a new Bretton Woods reorganization, and hopefully at the G20 or some other venue that is being put on the table. So, there are solutions, but people have to fight for it, and they have to have the courage to do so.
Okay, well, we have a question that actually is in that regard, and I'm going to pose it. It's from Melvin in France, and it is this. Shouldn't we push the world's politicians to set up educational systems linked to the UN in order to bring together researchers from around the world without getting into geopolitical games? Shouldn't we also allow the UN to open the doors to all citizens for meetings, to work on projects according to the challenges in the world? Now, I'd like to ask first, Cliff, if you have something to say, and then Helga, I'm sure you may have something as well as Ray. Cliff?
Fine, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, that's an interesting question. And of course, we have UNESCO at the UN, and there's various UN bodies and sponsored bodies, etc. So the essence, of course, is to the question, is the international cooperation with respect to intellectual work, research, scientific or technical or whatever, or peace research, for example. So, so yes, I think that's a very interesting and positive question. I would just say that, you know, it's never too late. You can always have diplomacy, even during a war. As a matter of fact, there was a diplomatic process going on between Russia and Ukraine until the US and Boris Johnson halted it. But we can remain optimistic that there's always a possibility for a diplomatic process to take place. And in the current global situation, as Helga noted, you have this new spirit of Bandung in the global south, which is, of course, encouraged by China and Russia and the BRICS countries, as well as other formats, such as the ASEAN countries. So I think the bottom line answer to the question is that there are many intellectuals and researchers around the world that would love to cooperate and are actually in the process of cooperation, just as this conference is an international conference. So yes, we need to reinforce international cooperation and think about this concept that the Chinese put forward of a shared future, a community with a shared future, which is, of course, what the spirit of the League of Nations is all about. And that's what the spirit of the United Nations is all about. We're an international community with a shared future. And I'll just refer back to the point I made on the Greek philosophy side, this concept of Dike, this concept of justice and fairness in relations between countries, international relations. And so those are sort of principles that we can cooperate on and think together about, whether someone is a historian or a sociologist or a lawyer or just the individual citizen. So I would say promotion of international intellectual cooperation in strengthening the United Nations, reforming the United Nations, as a matter of fact, is a very important task. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Helga, you have any comment? Or Ray?
Yes, I think this idea is very good, and we should explore it, because technological apartheid is stupid. It's only pushed by people who are worried that they have lost their creativity, because if you are sure that you always come up with new inventions and discoveries, you are happily giving away the old one. The idea to contain Russia from having access to advanced technologies, which is what the White House said on the 25th of January of actually last year. It does not work. I mean, look at Russia. They are making breakouts all the time, and the sanctions didn't function. They have now higher income from oil and gas than before. The idea to decouple from China and try to prevent China from having access to certain advanced technologies doesn't work either. China is on the backside of the moon. It's just not working. I think that we should go back to the ideas of Nicolaus of Cues, who already in the 15th century said that every time a discovery is made, it should be made available to everybody internationally, because it's so precious that one should not try to prevent the development from denying others to have access to this. So what would happen if you would have science cities all over the place, where countries from the developing sector, students could learn technologies? We could overcome the underdevelopment so quickly. And I think it's just an idea. I mean, if you think about the James Webb telescope, and sometimes you have to lift your eyes away from the planet Earth to discover that we are not Earthlings. We have a a situation where already the Hubble telescope discovered that there are 2 trillion galaxies, and we have to explore them. We have to develop new propulsion so that we can have interstellar travels. We can, have a completely different. We are the species of the universe and not just of the planet Earth. So, if you think about the vastness of the problems, and that we as a human species eventually have to develop alternatives to the Earth, because in about less than 2 billion years, our Earth will not be so good because of the developments on the sun. That may be too much for the next politician to think away, who only thinks about the next 4 years. But, the philosophers among us should think about, what is the character and the identity of mankind in the universe, and then we have the right way of thinking.
Okay, and Ray, I saw you had your hand up to answer as well.
Yeah, thanks. I think what needs to be recalled is that there are structures in being approved by almost all the world for dealing with these problems. First and foremost, the United Nations. So when Russia and China appeal for observance to the principles of the United Nations, they are just stating reality here, and they are exposing what has become of U.S. policy, which prescinds from the United Nations and creates something newly invented called the rules-based international order. Rules. I looked it up. I Googled it. I can't find any description of this. And it appears that rules-based really depends on who makes the rules, and that means the United States makes the rules. Now, parenthetically, the emphasis on the new entente between Russia and China is a deal breaker. It's a tectonic shift. It's been lost sight of. But the U.S. is no longer one prong on this equilateral triangle. The U.S. has got the short end of things. So this is really important. If Russia and China are calling for the UN and other internationally agreed documents to regulate foreign behavior abroad. Now, what's the problem? Well, the problem is that this rules-based international order, aside from the UN, well, that allows you to attack people like Iraq, which the UN Secretary General condemned as illegal. It allows you to go into Libya after deceiving 2 other members of the Security Council, I named them Russia and China, into thinking this would just be an air sort of thing, just to deny Libya from doing bad things. Okay, it requires this rule-based international law. It requires just forgetting about the UN. Now, the last thing I'll say is, worse still, the U.S. controls the UN. Okay. Now, this has been seen in this business about Iran, which intelligence still says is not working on a nuclear weapon. Okay. You wouldn't know that from the International Agency for Atomic, the International Atomic Agency, the IAEA. Okay. Worse still, Zaporozhye, the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. Okay, who's shelling Zaporozhye? Well, you have to believe that the Russians would be shelling themselves to believe it was the Russians, and yet the UN, the IAEA cannot say, even under fire from across the river, they can't say that it's the Ukrainians firing in a very dangerous way against Zaporozhye. This is similar to what happened in Syria. We know from really good studies done by Ted Postal and others that these so-called chemical attacks by Bashar al-Assad forces Never happened. They were staged by white helmets and others, okay? We know that, and we know that the UN inspectors found that to be the truth, and they were overruled by people put in by the US and said, no, and reversed their whole conclusion. So what I'm saying here is that China and Russia are still big principled adherents to the UN, including Article 51 and so forth. Putin just yesterday stressed that when one is put under existential threat, as Russia believes it to be, or believed it to be before February 24th in Ukraine, then the principle of self-defense can kick in, okay? I won't try to be a lawyer on that. The important thing for me about Ukraine is that it was not unprovoked. But what I'm saying here is that Putin laid out this argument just yesterday. It won't appear in the US or other Western media. But so they're adhering to the UN. The UN is dominated by the West, in person by the United States. So they realize that when people come to Zaporozhye and can't identify that where the shells are coming from, well, the UN is still being manipulated. So their educational agencies, sure, let them go ahead, let the UNESCO try to improve the situation. But if the US controls UNESCO, don't expect miracles, don't expect much progress. There has to be other ways besides the UN to do these things.
Okay, very good. So here's how we're going to proceed. We have some individual questions, which are to particularly to Cliff and to Helga. Then there are a couple of questions on Africa, which are very specific, which are from France, and then there is sort of a more general discussion, which I'll get to concerning the blacklist. So to go to the two particular questions, this is from Bernie, who is, I believe, from England. He says, in response to Dr. Kiracofe, it is imperative, if you will excuse such an imperious term, that the USA be respectfully persuaded of the wisdom of taking its place as an equal partner within the new order of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. This can be expedited by having the likes of Jeff Young or Diane Sayre elected to positions in Congress and Senate, by means of which they could assemble a chorus of sanity within the U.S. administration. As an independent citizen of the United Kingdom, but I will emphasize not as a subject of His Majesty King Charles III, I would like to ask the panel of distinguished speakers, but specifically you, Dr. Kiracofe, what strategies could be employed for the purpose of persuading the British government to abandon its reckless foreign policy toward Russia and China? There's a simple question.
Well, first of all, in the United States, we do need to remember that, not shockingly, but 100 senators voted on a bill a few weeks ago to condemn Russia as a so-called terrorist sponsoring state. Well, that's 100 senators, not 99, not 98, not 95, some object. No, it was unanimous. So that shows you the mood of Congress, at least the Senate, and the result would be similar in the House. If Diane Sayre could be elected, that would be one voice that could rise in opposition, and others in the House, of course, those elections. But realistically, in the United States, the political establishment, let's just say the ruling circles, ruling class, the ruling circles have a hammerlock on foreign policy, which is given to congresspersons through various means, the policy line originating up in New York at the Council on Foreign Relations, and then making its way through the various think tanks and universities, and kind of ending up in Congress. So what we're confronting is a very powerful, more powerful than ever, frankly, because there's very little dissent in Congress. How much dissent is there on the Ukraine situation. A few voices, but just a handful, although that's a very good start. So the political problem in the United States is that the establishment, the ruling circles are very powerful, and they're reinforced by the media, which is not really independent. The media is an adjunct to the political establishment. We don't really have an independent, sure, we have a free press, but who owns it? And who do the owners hire? And those who are hired have to stick within certain bounds and are encumbered by taboos, or else they lose their job as a journalist. And I myself have belonged to national journalism associations. So in terms of the United States, the political situation is very difficult, but it's good that people like Dan and others are speaking out and campaigning, and they need to continue, just like Ray said, don't give up. As far as the United Kingdom goes, you know, the phrase British brains and American brawn when it comes to wars and foreign policy is an apt phrase. We can recall that the key center in England of foreign policy thought, which is the Royal Institute of International Affairs, nicknamed Chatham House, is the font of UK foreign policy thinking, backed up by such right-wing neoconservative groups as the Henry Jackson Society and other, there's another policy group there. And we need to recall that the American Council on Foreign Relations in New York, that is the establishment's foreign policy maker, the New York Council on Foreign Relations was created as an offshoot of the British Chatham House, the British Royal Institute. So the British intellectuals and foreign policy people and influential folks, going back to the old Round Table group and the Rhodes group and the Rothschild sponsorships and all of that stuff in England, permeates the US establishment via the Council on Foreign Relations. And of course, the British Fabian Society started to penetrate American ruling circles in the late 19th century, 1890s, early 1900s. So there's a very strong British influence over American foreign policy, almost as if Washington has been recolonized mentally when it comes to foreign policy. So the British have have their own establishment and have their own issues to try to create some alternative voices. And of course, we can see how Mr. Corbyn got smashed by the so-called left in the Labour Party. Well, now, how can a leading member of the Labour Party who has independent views on foreign policy that challenge the British establishment just get smashed by his own party? What's going on there? So in answer to your excellent question, we need to, on both sides of the pond, so to speak, need to push forward and support independent voices, such as occur in England or such as occur in the United States, and try to help them get elected to the respective parliamentary bodies or Congress. That's it.
Okay, let me first just answer to check either Ray, would you like to say anything about this, or Helga? Otherwise, I will continue.
No, thanks.
Okay, very good. So actually what I'm going to do is go to the Africa questions first, because it occurred to me that the question for Helga can be taken up when we get to the blacklist questions as well. So there were two questions. They're both from France. First was, why are the United States and France probably still complicit in and directly or indirectly supporting wars in sub-Saharan Africa? That's the first question. The second question stated, recently the United Kingdom signed an agreement with Rwanda for the transfer of refugees to Rwandan territory. However, everyone knows that Rwanda does not have the necessary surface area to accommodate all the refugees from the United Kingdom. And for some and others, this approach is the materialization of the balkanization of the Democratic Republic of Congo, because the livable space being non-existent in Rwanda, the latter, Rwanda, will continue to see its aggression on the DR, on the Democratic Republic of the Congo, accentuated. In other words, Rwanda would send these people there, ostensibly. How do the various speakers interpret and judge this agreement on the transfer of refugees? Okay, so those are the two questions. Who would like to start? I'm going to start. Ray, if you don't have anything, I'll go to Helga. Okay.
Please.
Well, I think it's a complete expression that racism is alive and kicking. I mean, this idea, is so absolutely immoral and based on really colonialist thinking. And I think that's really all I want to say to that, because, the Macron, for example, makes very nice speeches, but, when you look at the actual deeds which follow, there is a huge discrepancy. I think the entire EU policy towards Africa is one of racism and imperialism, Malthusianism. They don't, what they say, all these proposals by, the former head of the Bank of England to give the the African countries a certain amount of money per year if they promise not to develop. The whole idea of sustainable development, no infrastructure, no big projects. They want to maintain the underdevelopment, and they can run around in Africa as much as they want to. The Africans have come to their own conclusions in the long time. Who is their friend, and who is their would-be colonial master? I think this is rapidly changing. I think the Africans have come to the conclusion that China and Russia are their friends, and that the Europeans and the Americans are not.
Okay. So, go ahead, Ray, please.
Yeah, I would just like to add to that, broadening it out just a little bit. We talked about justice before, and we know from very sad experience for centuries the injustice of racism, colonialism, and keeping people poor. Okay. Now, we talked a good bit about the ancient Greeks, but I come from a Christian Hebrew tradition, Hebrew going back about the same time as the Greeks. And the Hebrew word for justice, Aramaic earlier, was tekah. Its denotation, not its connotation. The denotation of tekah was showing mercy to the poor. Whoa, justice. Unbiased? Yes. Prejudice to the core in favor of those pushed to the sides, those not allowed to develop. Now, in America, we have this blindfolded lady with scales, and she's not allowed to see because she doesn't want to show bias or prejudice. Suffice it to say that the biblical notion of justice is biased and prejudiced to the core in favor of the poor. Now, most of the poor are people of color. Most Westerners consider Russia just about people of color as well. Well, with the new setup, and I call it bipolar, not multipolar, We have the lily white West arrayed against the rest of the world, China, India, South Africa, Argentina, Iran, Pakistan, and Russia. So this is the tectonic shift. This is what has been brought by Ukraine. Now, what happens to all these people? Well, it doesn't appear that King Charles is really interested in fixing things, or that he even could if he wanted to. So that's why it's up to us in our individual countries to do what we can to bring some sense to people. It shouldn't have to be far leftists like Sada Wagenknecht in Germany to say, this is ridiculous. So we're going to freeze so that the Ukrainians can sell 70% of our arms in the black market? Give us a break. I still think, at the risk of saying this for many years, I still think the Europeans will come to their senses. Maybe it takes 10 blankets to come to your senses, but I still think that there's going to be an uproar in Europe. I hope it's a peaceful one, like Helga said, but it's going to be big. And we need to be prepared for it by educating our own populaces as to what's really at stake here. And for those who come from the Hebrew Christian tradition, and I would add Muslim tradition as well, the prophet was just as hard on the business of, just as strong on the business of justice. We have to give what we Catholics call a real preference for the poor. That means in our decisions, we need to not necessarily be so unbiased as to not realize that there are people disadvantaged in this world and not to make it still worse for them.
Okay, very good. Cliff, you have any thoughts, or should we continue?
I can just be very brief. I've been to Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Namibia. And I've been to a lot of North Africa, Egypt, and Morocco, Tunisia. So I've seen a number of countries on the African continent. And I agree with Helga that the focus on Africa should be one of economic development and lifting people out of poverty, and the creation of infrastructure projects, and naturally the improvement, development of agriculture, so people can feed themselves, and education and health, hospitals, and so on. So there's a lot of very positive things that can be done on the African continent, whether in North Africa or sub-Saharan Africa or Central. And we, the United States, should certainly be involved in a constructive way, constructive engagement. But the mode of our involvement right now is an attempt to push China and Russia out of Africa. Well, now, that's not possible. As Helga pointed out, countries in the global south have long memories, and they know who their friends are and who their friends aren't. And former European colonial powers aren't necessarily the friends of Africa, nor is the United States, unfortunately, as things have developed here. So it's inevitable, and it's ongoing now, that China and Russia will have more and more influence in Africa through economic development projects, as well as education and health and other types of cooperation with African countries. This is nothing new for Russia or for China. It goes back many decades. So it's a very natural expression of Russian and Chinese foreign policy. And of course, there are strategies and global strategy. So in one sense, I'm not optimistic about the US role in Africa, which is negative, but I am optimistic about the concrete results of Chinese economic development projects, Russia, cooperation with Russia, and I believe the Japanese will become involved in projects in Africa. And of course, India also can become active in various development projects and educational projects. So overall, with respect to Africa, I'm an optimist. And I think African countries are increasingly aware of the necessity to protect their sovereignty and their independent development. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So what we have is we're coming up on time, but we have a little bit of time to take a couple other questions. We have two remarks concerning, which are, you'll see what they are. Helga raised the issue of any dissent from the official narrative being labeled as disinformation or just totally suppressed. This assault on rational debate includes the targeting of Edward Snowden, Julian Assange, and others. I would even say it includes President Biden's recent speech demonizing his opposition. And someone else then adds, all reasonable people would agree with the perspective being laid out here. And that underscores the desperation of the global elites to suppress any deliberation. Could you address the Center for Counter-Disinformation hit lists and the wave of assassinations and attempts in this context? Now, since everybody that's presently here speaking is on that list, it would seem that that's a question that would be for the panel as a whole. So why don't I take you first, Ray?
Well, let me just go back to a German word that Helga used, Gleichschaltung. Okay, it means to compress everything into one world view or one narrative. That's what we're up against, folks. The media is controlled by people profiteering on these wars. The media is controlled by corporations, and the academia fits right in with all this. So how do we cut this Gordian knot? Well, I dare say that we're intelligent and imaginative enough to figure out how to do it. Now, we've been wringing our hands and moaning and groaning and exposing, to our credit, what's going on. We have to do something about it, okay? I like to use an analogy here. It's called the Noah principle, and it's very simple. Here it is. No more awards for predicting rain. Awards only for building arks. Okay, got it? So what we need to do is build a huge ark for all of us together, but we also need to do little arks like the one we're actually building as I speak in Raleigh, North Carolina, for reasons I mentioned before. Arks are what's going to save us, and what's not going to save us, I dare say, is wringing our hands and saying, oh, isn't it awful? It is awful. And it's a tough nut to crack. But there's hope, and we do break through on occasion. And I would point out in this connection that when John McCain, right after the coup in Kiev, for those who don't know about the coup in Kiev, please read up on it, the most blatant coup in history, appropriately described, because it was advertised on YouTube 2.5 weeks before. If you don't know about that, then you don't realize how things have been suppressed and how the media was allowed to do this. Now, this small example is one thing. McCain wrote this op-ed, and he said, the seizure of Crimea, the annexation of Crimea, was unprovoked. So here it was, July 2014, I wrote a little note to the editor and saying, look, it wasn't unprovoked. I can prove it. And you guys, you, the Washington Post, you say that history starts on the 23rd of February 2014. You talk about Putin convening a secret meeting of his advisors on the 23rd of February 2014 as soon as he got back here from Sochi and deciding to capture Crimea. And you never mentioned what happened the day before the coup in Kiev. Please, readers of the Washington Post, realize that there isn't one scintilla of evidence that it ever entered into Putin's head to annex Crimea before what happened the previous day, okay? Not one scintilla. So they published that. And I was shocked because it was early February. I think people were the censors may have been taking time off to go sip martinis in the Hamptons of Long Island, but it got through. Now, why do I mention that? Well, because that's the first time the Ukrainians came after me. They came after me big time, but it doesn't really matter. It's almost a badge of courage. So to see myself on the same list, oddly, the first 30 or so people having been people who participated in this kind of conference under the Schiller auspices, seeing myself on that list was actually a badge of courage. And at the same time, if I were younger and people like Scott Ritter and people, I would be much more concerned because these people are crazy. There's nothing to prevent Ukrainian extreme right nationalists, pro-Nazis, if you will, from doing one or the other of us in. It's already happened. So that's about all I have to say about that and the famous list.
Okay, fine. Cliff?
Okay, I hope you can hear me. Just a few comments. Number one, I'm a political scientist, and so my job is to do objective analysis of international affairs. I've been doing this since grad school, hopefully, since the early 1970s, actually. So it's about 50 years. I've written a number of articles, and as a writer, this is my way of fighting the situation that we're in, being a journalist. And I've written a number of articles for China Focus, for Global Times, for several Beijing Review, for several publications in China, where I'm much freer to write than I am in the United States, given the media situation here in the United States. And my first piece on Ukraine was in February of 2014. And it was just a typical cold analysis by myself. And I made the point that the future situation in Ukraine is there's only three possibilities. One was a just internal settlement, which would allow a degree of autonomy in the eastern and southern Russian cultural areas. And that could be achieved through federalization rather than a unitary state, the creation of a federal state through a constitution and constitutional processes. So number one, then option was to give autonomy and to the aggrieved zone, Russian culture zones, Donbass, etc. Number two, I said that failing that, there'd be a civil war. Well, we've noticed that, haven't we? And number three, I said the future, in such case, would be partition of Ukraine, which is to say the old area, Novorossiya area, which is the Donbass and the east and the south, all the way out through Odessa to Transnistria, that area was given by Lenin to this so-called fake Ukraine state in 1922. And the partition of Ukraine, as far as I can see, depending on how the war goes, that Novorossiya zone will be annexed, well, not really annexed, it will be absorbed into Russia when the peoples of the region vote in their respective plebiscites. So what we are going to see, in my view, is a partitioned Ukraine, irrespective of what NATO and the United States would like to see. On the other hand, we could see it expanding into a European-wide war, if that's what NATO would like to see. That very well can happen, unfortunately. With respect to the state apparatus in so-called Ukraine, the state apparatus is penetrated by Nazi philosophy. A friend of mine corrected me when I said neo-Nazi. She told me, no, these are the direct descendants of the Nazis in Germany and their servants in the Ukrainian Nazi networks back in World War II and the early Cold War. So we're not talking about neo-Nazis in Ukraine. We're talking about actual ideological Nazis whose grandparents supported Hitler, like that woman up in Canada who happens to be their foreign minister. Her grandfather was a Nazi supporter of Hitler, running a newspaper in Ukraine. So what we're dealing with in the Ukrainian government apparatus, and of course, there are patriotic Ukrainians who are not Nazis, serving their government in a what they believe to be a patriotic way. All right, but what about the pro-Nazi networks inside the actual Nazis? And this CCD, the Center for Countering Disinformation. Desinformatia is a Russian phrase and it comes out of the Cold War, et cetera, et cetera. We would just say propaganda, or we would just say psychological warfare or something along those lines. The real terrorists are the CCD people and the folks in the US State Department and other US government agencies and the Pentagon who are lying to the American people and who are lying to the world, i.e. fomenting this proxy war and then lying about it through American propaganda, psychological warfare, and what is also, in more recent terms, it's called perception management, and it's also called cognitive warfare. So what the CCD apparatus and other organs inside the Ukrainian state apparatus, what they do is they are the ones who are the information terrorists. They are the ones trying to suppress free speech and undermine the American Constitution and other constitutions in Europe, for example. So in my view, we have a clear Nazi culture in Ukraine dating back to the 1920s and 30s through some of their sociologists and anthropologists when they propounded eugenics and racial anthropology that was in line with the German Nazi philosophy. And those intellectual circles from the 20s and 30s morphed into the World War II apparatus behind such people as Bandera, but not just Bandera. And then in the Cold War were utilized by Ray's old organization, the CIA, were mobilized to support the anti-communist crusade in Europe. The idea being, well, let's use Nazis against communists. So my reflection would simply be that what we're really dealing with in the CCD is an American-supported, European-supported nexus of late era Nazi propaganda directed against Western citizens or anyone throughout the world, actually, on that list that we're all on. There are people from China and people from all over the world on that list. So that would just be my brief comment, that what we're facing is we're facing a fascist operation sponsored by our own government, which is a disgrace. Thanks.
Very clear. Helga?
Well, it's actually really global NATO, because what these forces, they have set up a network of institutions in many places, all supposed to counter fake news, to counter disinformation. Like in the European Union, they have a thing like that. Now, I was quite shocked to see that the head of the German Verfassungsschutz had a big interview 2 weeks ago in a Sunday paper, having the total line, what is Russian disinformation? You're not allowed to say that the sanctions don't function. You're not allowed to say that, it's a whole litany of things you are not allowed to say. And I frankly think it's an insult to my intelligence and to the intelligence of many other people. I mean, it's a fact. The sanctions did not function. Russia did not collapse, but they were forced to have more deals with China. They're more selling oil and gas to India. They are diversifying. They're doing quite well in doing it. I think these people have forgotten that there is such a thing as a blowback. If you try to impose a policy which goes against the fundamental interest of the people you are doing it to, they tend to move together. I mean, the big accomplishment of these policies of end of history, what Fukuyama was talking about, is that there is now a tectonic shift with the alliance of Russia and China, which would never have happened that quickly without the policy of trying to impose liberal democracy all over the world by regime change, color revolution, and all of these things. So these countries have, many with them have drawn the conclusion, and that's why you have the emergence of a new world economic order, which would never have happened, at least not that quickly, if there would not have been the effort to impose these policies, which are fundamentally against the interest of the countries which are targeted. So I don't think it's very smart. It's an insult to the intelligence of people, but it's a stupid policy, even from the standpoint of those who are pushing it. So, that's why I think it's very dangerous. But, for example, I think all the people who are on the list of the CCD or the Mirotvorets list, there are tens of thousands of people. They all should unite, and then, we can really counter this effort to silence people who are having just a different view. And frankly, the fact that the 31st people on the list, apart from Mr. Fuller, but I think Mr. Fuller also was, he was also speaking at this. So it's really the first 30 people. They were all speakers at Schiller conferences. I mean, that really should also tell you it's not just about the narrative about Ukraine. Because what were these conferences we had since April? These were conferences all discussing the totality and the complexity of the strategic situation, which includes the fact that we have a systemic collapse of the financial system, which actually is the real driver of the war danger, and that we need a dialogue of classical cultures. We were discussing the question of how to make the world function better, how to compensate for the fact that the present leaderships of many countries are just not the greatest shakes. If you compare the leaders of today with people like Indira Gandhi, Nehru, Mahatma Gandhi, Zhou Enlai, or Adenauer, Charles de Gaulle, Enrico Mattei, I mean, these are really not very convincing political leaderships. I mean, they're incompetent and bungling, like the present economic minister and the foreign minister of Germany. They're just bungling, in ways which is really extremely disturbing. naturally driven by ideologies. So what we were doing is we were trying to discuss how to, come up with policy suggestions. And I agree with you, Ray, that we shouldn't whine. I always tell the speakers at our conference, please spend maximum 10% in analysis and 90% in solutions, because that is what really counts. So the concept of the big arc and the many small arcs, I fully agree with. So, and that reminded me of the fact that all the big terrorism of the past was always trying to knock out people who would have concepts, like Walter Rathenau after Rapallo. After 1 year, Rapallo, everything was killed who had participated in that idea. And what was Rapallo all about? It was an attempt by Rathenau to undo the absolute insane principles of the Versailles Treaty, which left no breathing room for Germany and led naturally then to World War II and the rise of the Nazis, by the way, by trying to have a different kind of policy in respect to the German economy and Russia. So this option was knocked out. Then, naturally, I could make a very long list, but a lot of the rough terrorism, the Baader-Meinhof terrorism or the Red Brigades in Italy in the 70s, they knocked out not people who were in any way, Nazis or bad. They were all leaders in their respective field. Let it be industry, let it be nuclear energy, let it be banking like Alfred Herrhausen or Rohwedder. These were strategic murders of people who would come up with ideas of a new paradigm or, just make the world better. What was the crime of Alfred Herrhausen? He had dared to propose a debt moratorium for the developing countries because the debt was strangulating development. That was not allowed. He was proposing the development of Poland, independent but very parallel to what LaRouche had proposed, and what became the productive triangle. So these are all people who produce concepts. So we should not allow that the people who are on that list are reduced to having the wrong thing to say about Ukraine, because it's a much larger issue than Ukraine. And what's really at stake is the question of, is it allowed to discuss self-government? What the Federalist Papers did for the American early republic. Are citizens allowed to discuss what are better ways to govern national policy, international policy? And there you come to the question is, are we still a democracy? Is the Western democracy and the rules-based order, has that not long become a dictatorship which suppresses free speech? Because that is exactly what we are seeing. So I think we have to have the courage to discuss these issues, and all people on the list unite.
All right. I would just also reference that we will be starting a panel which will be dealing with exactly that, defend the right to deliberate. That'll be panel 2 on this conference, and that's actually scheduled to start in about 45 minutes. What we're going to do now is just go to concluding remarks by everyone. In doing that, I'll just reference that question I was going to give to you, Helga, but I realized it's from someone in Germany, and I realized to give you this question alone would be engaging in ethnic profiling, and that's one thing I definitely don't want to be accused of. So the question, it actually is a thesis. It says, my thesis: a large part of the population is captivated by nominalism, opinions, and feelings. Instead of using the 5 senses, reason, and the laws of logic to recognize truths according to scholasticism, the great mass can therefore only be brought to violence by brutal tribulations, but not to reason. That's the thesis. Now, since we've had this whole discussion of nemesis and arcs and the idea of the arc of the moral universe being along bending to justice, I'd like that everyone this is sort of your final statement, and we're going to close. You don't have to address what this says per se, but keep it in mind as you give us our close and send us on our way. So, Cliff, let's go to you first. Try to be concise, and then we'll go to Ray and then Helga.
Well, I'd say let's use a metaphor from a Dostoevsky novel, which translates to the possessed, or you can translate it the demons. And the Dostoevsky novel is a story about, roughly speaking, a village that gets overtaken by demons in the form of demonic ideas, ideology. Particularly, Dostoevsky was commenting on the nihilism as a philosophical position, the nihilism of Nechayev, for example. So, of course, as this village gets taken over by demons and demonic ideas in the minds of prominent people in the village, you get a mess. And I think, to me, that's an appropriate metaphor for what's going on in the West in terms of what's happened to the Western leadership, so-called Western elites. They're possessed by demons, demonic ideas, demonic ideologies. And as Helga pointed out, also by their sheer incompetence. So I would just put forward that we need to be on our guard against allowing such demonic ideas and this sense of nihilism to advance any further around the world. And thus, I agree with Helga that all of us on the list, but anyone in the world concerned about freedom of speech and democracy get together. Thank you.
Thank you. Ray?
Well, thanks. Dostoevsky's The Possessed is golden. Just as golden is his story about the Grand Inquisitor in Bratya Karamazovi, Brothers Karamazov. I suspect that that has a direct analogy to what we face today in terms of this Gleichschaltung, in terms of this narrative that everyone must believe, otherwise they're subjected to the fire, so to speak. I applaud the Schiller Institute. I like what Helga just said about, hey, our function here is, while we're still allowed to discuss these things, we discuss them. It's big. The title of this event was Inspiring People to Survive the Greatest Crisis in World History. Implicit in that, of course, is the use of nuclear weapons for the first time since they were used against Japan. Now, one would think that since this is a crisis unparalleled in human history, and I didn't invent the title of this event, but I agree with it, that you would see the Council of Foreign Relations or the Eisenhower Institute or the Carnegie Foundation, you would see them arranging talks by people even more distinguished than me, okay? Has been nothing. Zilch. The head of the Council of Foreign Relations, Richard Haas, my God, he speaks drivel and more drivel about Ukraine and whatever else he speaks out of the paradigm of exceptionalism because, of course, he is exceptional. And to prove that, he was head of the policy planning at the State Department at a crucial time when everything fell off the wheels. So what am I saying here? I'm saying that something else that Helga said, however ironic it sounds, needs to be emphasized. And that is, she talked about the prospect of a nuclear holocaust as, quote, unbelievably real, end quote. I see our task as making this unbelievably real possibility into something that's believably real. And that should be possible if we exercise not only our imaginations and our energies, but our courage. Lastly, I would like to go back to Dr. Martin Luther King and quote him for, I think he holds the key to what we're about here. And that is in his famous letter from the Birmingham City Jail, which is famous for many other things. My favorite passage is this, quote, like a boil that can never be healed, but must be opened up with all its pus-flowing ugliness to the natural medicines of air and light, so too injustice and lies must be exposed with all the friction their exposure creates to the light of human conscience and the air of national opinion before it can be cured. That's our job. I thank the Schiller Institute for getting us down that road.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you very much. Helga?
Well, and I thank you, Cliff and Ray and all the others who have been participants in the Schiller conferences, actually since 2.5 years when we had to go on this virtual conference because of the pandemic. Because, you know, we have a unique capability because of the more than half a century work of this movement, LaRouche, and our international movement. We have, you know, developed friends all over the world in, you know, countries which, you know, are small and large and poor and whatnot. But that has resulted in the fact that we do have an international community of people who agree, you know, either with everything we say or at least with parts of it. And the fact that we have been able to establish that kind of a discussion process is really not existing anywhere. And I can assure you, you know, you can look around and see if there are people who bring together people who are from the left, from the right. You know, I think these categories don't mean much, especially when you have a seismic change in history like now. And we always have proceeded with the approach of the coincidence of opposites, the idea that, you know, human reason can always find a higher level of reason which overcomes the division. So we are really not affected by partisan prejudice and bias and so forth, but we are trying to, you know, discuss principles in art, in science, in economics. And I think this is a very precious thing to do. But nevertheless, given the fact that we have been slandered more than anybody else, Ramsey Clark in this famous tribunal of 95 said, you know, that Lyndon LaRouche was, you know, the law has been bended and broken in the United States more than in any other case in the entire history of the United States. And the world has been, you know, if I would write down all the slanders which have been used against us, and we have long lists of where people got harassed, were called up by diplomats and told that they would lose everything if they would not stop working with us. So it really has been a lot. And I think Lyndon LaRouche has been slandered more than Putin and Xi Jinping together, and that means a lot. And I think I could add a couple of other so-called dictators, and it still would be in favor of LaRouche, if you call that a favor. So I think it's also high time, and that's why I'm thanking you that you did have the courage to appear with us on these programs, because a lot of people are, harassed, or even they are, why should I get in trouble even looking at that? And that is still a big problem, and the enemy knows that, and they're trying to, keep, making the division and divide and conquer and so forth. But I think, everything in my view, and that now you can say that's just her view because, it's her late husband. I really think that the theoretical work of LaRouche is the absolute key to save this world, because and unfortunately one cannot even publish everything which should be published, and my words will become clearer, I hope, in the near future. But the ideas of LaRouche pertain to the flaws of the monetary system, the flaws of methodological culture. I tried to address that in my opening remarks this morning, whenever it was in the United States morning, because this idea of a flat Earth, a Euclidean nominalist, reductionist outlook versus the real universe of the complex domain of Platonic ideas. People have to study that, and that is a knowledge which is really absolutely crucial if we want to get out of it. So tomorrow we will have a whole panel about the LaRouche Legacy Foundation and the library which we are opening up. So I would just like to conclude with the fact that, if you have any idea that what we are talking about makes any sense, please take the effort and start looking seriously at some of the writings of LaRouche, and you will see that it opens up entire universes, and you will enjoy it.
Okay. Ray McGovern, Dr. Cliff Kiracofe, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, we want to thank you, of course, for being who you are and also doing this panel. And we want to invite everybody to join us for panel 2, which is called Defend the Right to Deliberate, Speak Out Against Blacklists and the Suppression of the Search for Truth. Before I end, I also want to make sure I thank Dr. Jozef Mikloško, Slovak Republic, former Vice Premier of Czechoslovakia, Dr. Ding Yifan of China, Professor Georgy Toloraya of the Russian Federation as well for their comments. And we want to invite everyone that saw this program to work on the matters that you've heard about. If you're leaving us at this point, and if you aren't, to join us at 2 p.m. for panel 2. See you then.